I feel like today's video is going to get quite messy. Ahoy hoy folks, hello and welcome to today's video. My name's Sean, aka Uncle Frogface. If you're new here, then welcome. If you're not new, then welcome back. So today we are going to be doing a little bit of preparation for another project that I want to do. So for those of you that don't know, as well as my usual art on here and different crafts, I like to make props. So in fact, this Grogu back here and the Vibroblade that he's holding, got a little dragon up on the wall. There's lots of bits around this office that are props that I have made. And there's one prop that I've always wanted, and yeah, there are now a few versions of it. So this is what I would like to make. So for those of you that don't know, if you're not horror fans, for instance, this is the Necronomicon from the film franchise Evil Dead. So we've actually got the original Evil Dead movie, we've got Evil Dead the remake, and then there is Evil Dead Rises, which is the second in the new, which I believe is going to be trilogy. And they all look different, but they're all essentially the same thing. It's the Necronomicon, based on Lovecraft's Necronomicon, the Book of the Dead, bound in human flesh, all of that kind of stuff. So I want to make my own version as kind of a macabre sketchbook for myself. And in order to do that, one of the things I need, well, firstly I need to learn how to bookbind. That'll be a different video when we actually come to making the prop itself. But I need some suitable paper for it. So today we're going to look at aging paper so that we can get a nice kind of old parchment look on the paper. And there are various ways of doing this. So we're going to be doing a little bit of experimentation to find out what is the best way of making aged paper for props. And welcome to, well, this is kind of like my lab where you can see I've got various liquids in front of me. In fact, this one is just my cup of tea. So let me just move that out of the way so that I don't accidentally contaminate the rest of the experiment. That is a very nice cup of tea. Speaking of tea, there are three main ways of staining paper. So I have made props for theatre and stage and TV and all sorts. So I know that there are three main ways of staining paper, and they are coffee, tea, and artist material, so paints and inks and things like that. So what I've done here is I've got 1 cup of now cooled down but very strong black coffee, a very strong black tea, also cooled down, and this is just some acrylic paint. In fact, I used burnt sienna and raw sienna. So the reason I've done that is because the colour of the coffee, when you kind of look up very close, and you'll see this as we're staining paper, has a very neutral brown colour, whereas the tea has a very warm yellowish, almost going into red temperature. So the sienna means I can kind of go in the middle of those two. So I want to balance out the colours that we've got. So there are various things that you can do to make paper look different as you're staining it, and that's what we're going to test today. So firstly, I want to test what the colours look like in each of these things. So in the coffee, the tea, and in the paint. I also want to test what the different drying parameters will do. So does it look different if I let it dry naturally, if I let it dry with a hairdryer, or if I let it dry in a low oven? Then I want to test whether repeated exposure, so dyeing it, then leaving it, then dyeing it again, then leaving it, whether we can build up deeper colour. That's something I want to experiment with. I also want to experiment with other additives, so just like you would with watercolour, things like salt, bicarbonate of soda, pencil shavings, all of that kind of stuff that can then soak up some of the liquid as the paper is wet, whether that's going to give a mottled effect, whether spraying from a spray bottle is going to give different effects as well. So these are all the things that I want to try and replicate a really good aged paper. So first things first, let's try, and I've got lots of little bits of paper cut out here. And by the way, this is just standard, no frills printer paper. I'm not going for anything expensive here. I'm not using, you know, Bristol board or watercolor paper. And this is literally just, you know, the cheapest printer paper that I have at home. This is what I use for doing, you know, warm-up sketches and stuff. So first thing I want to do is to try each of these and just see what they look like with a quick dip and see how the colours look. So we'll start with the coffee. Okay, so doing a little bit of a double dip on that, and I'm just going to lay this on this MDF board. You can see actually it's pretty close to the colour of the MDF. Let's do the same with the tea. Excellent, and then let's do the same with the paint. Okay, so we have got our 3 initial tests. So let's leave these to dry. I'll hit them with a hairdryer, and then we'll come back in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. So that was the first part of the experiment, and let's just have a look at our results. So I've labelled all of these coffee, and a little H for hairdryer, T, H, paint, H. So the coffee has this very kind of neutral brown colour, which is actually really nice. It's soaked through really well. You can see against the white the difference in the colour. It also has a slight dustiness to it as well from the coffee grounds in there, but they do rub off, so that's not something that's going to be permanent. We also have the tea. So the tea gives a slight mottled effect. It's a much warmer colour as well. Again, soaks through very, very nicely. And then we have the paint, which I think is the least impressive in terms of dyeing the paper, but interesting result when a bit of paint, a little blob in there, got on there, and it's created here and up here. It's almost like a mold spot or an age spot. So that's very interesting. You can see where it's creased as well. It's also collected that paint and created a crease in the paper. That's something we're going to be experimenting with as well. So what I want to do now that we know what these look like with the hairdryer drying them, I want to do the same thing, but I want to do one of each and just let them naturally dry on this board. Then I want to do one of each and dry them in the oven and see whether that makes any difference. And for drying things in the oven, you generally want it on, you know, 100 to 130 degrees centigrade, so a low heat, and just leave it in there. You don't want to cook it, you just want to dry it out, evaporate the water. So let's start with just dipping these. Again, we'll double dip everything, and we'll just dip these for air drying, and then I'll do the same for the oven as well, and I'll do that off camera because obviously I have to go downstairs to do that. But I'll be back once all of these are done, and we'll see what they look like when we come back. Well, this has come up with some unexpected results. So the air dry ones are still slightly moist, so they aren't quite dry yet, but they're getting there. But if we compare, let's have a look at the coffee one. So we've got coffee that's air dried, coffee that's hair dryer dried, and coffee that is oven dried. Now the hair dryer dried and the oven dried, very similar, and I'm expecting that this is going to be very similar when it's fully dried as well. In fact, lay it on top of there. There's really not any difference in the tone at all. There is a slight difference when we start looking at the tea. So the air dried, again, I think that's going to be exactly the same as the hair dryer dried in terms of colour when it is fully dry. The hairdryer one is here, and this is the oven dried one, and you can see that the application of the heat from the oven has actually around the edges darkened the paper slightly and has intensified the overall colour of the paper. So in terms of tea staining, I do think the oven is better. Now, paint. Yeah, the paint here still is not dry, but it doesn't really make that much difference because it's not staining the paper. And that is really down to the makeup of acrylic paint. So acrylic paint is a pigment which is very finely ground, very finely milled particles in a binder. Putting it in water dissolves the binder, but then you're just left with these particulates in the water, and they're not really doing a very good job at staining. What they are doing a good job at is these additional details around the edges. I think that the burnt umber is way too much. Was it umber or sienna? It's sienna, isn't it? The burnt sienna is way too much, but the raw sienna is a nice texture and tone. I think against the tea is really nice as well. So I think it's going to be a case of combining some of these together. Now, the other thing to note, and that you will definitely have noticed, is the shape of the paper. So hair drying it, the paper flops all over the place, air gets underneath it, it lifts up and blah, 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 blah. And we get a kind of a textured paper. It looks like it's been thumbed through and used a lot, and yeah, it's not creased, but it's definitely slightly deformed. That increases a little bit with the oven drying, and in fact it curls quite a lot. It curls at the edges, so then you have to lay it flat. And it gives this kind of striation in the paper, which is really nice. Interestingly, when we do it and we let it air dry, as you can see, this is still perfectly flat. There are no creases, there's no deformation at all in the paper. So I think that part really comes down to what are you trying to get from your end result? Are you trying to get like something that's been displayed in a case and hasn't been touched for hundreds of years? In that case, letting the paper air dry on something nice and flat is probably going to give you a really nice finish. If, however, you want like an old map or a scroll or spell parchment, or like I'm doing, a very old book, then I think oven drying or hairdryer drying is the way to go. And I would probably edge towards the oven drying. It's actually very quick, and if you've got all of your paper there, you can literally stain it, place it, pop it in. You could be staining the next piece whilst that's drying. It dries very quick. It actually dries quicker than the hairdryer, in my experience anyway. Right, so I think for myself going forward, I'm going to do the oven drying technique, but something else I wanted to try is a repeated exposure. So let me put all of my little swatches over here. We'll let those continue to dry. And I am going to use the hairdryer for this. And I think I use the tea because it has the most staining power. And I'm going to take one of these long strips and I'm going to dunk in nearly all of it, just leaving a little bit of a tab for myself. Okay, and we're going to bring that out. And then I'm going to use the hairdryer and dry this out. Okay, and now that that is pretty much dry, I'm going to dip again, but I'm going to leave some of this first dip out, and then basically we'll be able to see as this layers up what each level of dipping does to the paper. And I'll come back here, I'll do this with the tea and with the coffee, and I'll come back and show you the results. Okay, welcome back, and as you can see, I have finished my experiment with the tea, and this is very interesting. So we get a nice gradual increase in the saturation of the colour, and there's a real warmth in this as well, which is really, really nice. You can see I dipped it 5 times, I left it in for 10 seconds each time, so not very long at all, and we've got a really nice spectrum of that lovely warm colour. Now, I did the same with the coffee, and something very interesting happened. Let me show you. First of all, you'll notice this is shorter, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the intensity of the colour really doesn't change that much with each dip. And I did exactly the same thing. I dipped it for 10 seconds each dip, and what we do have, instead of an increase in the intensity of the colour, we have these tide marks. Can you see that just there? And they, to me, are incredibly reminiscent of kind of damp damage that you get at the edge of books that have been exposed to moisture. So that's a very interesting tool that we might be able to use. Now, as I said, this one is much shorter than this one. This one I only managed to dip 4 times, and then it actually broke. So I think there might be something in the makeup of the coffee itself that is causing the paper to degrade, and you know, repeated exposure is not working. So there are a few other things I want to test, and I will be using the oven for this. So I'll go and get a pan, I'll come back and I'll show you what I want to do. And I think I pretty much know what I'm going to do now. I think for my base colour we're going to be using tea, and then for details over that we're going to be using the coffee and maybe a bit of paint as well. So I'll be back in just a moment and we'll do a little bit more experimentation. I'm sure Betty Crocker won't mind if I use a pan for making paper instead of pastries. But let's get to our final few experiments. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I'm going to do 5. Am I going to fit them all on here? Yeah, I think so. So the first thing I want to do is just to screw this up. I'm going to screw this up first and then I'm going to dip it. And I'm hoping that all of those creases that are in there are going to have some of that tea rest inside of it. So let's give it a 10-second dip. Lovely. Right, that's one. And let's lay that down. So in a similar vein, you might notice I've got some pieces of foil here. So I want to have this just down here, and I want to just do a normal dip and then lay it on top of the foil and see whether that gives us any kind of texture as well. I think that's enough of a dip. Let's pop that on there. You can see with this one we're already getting pooling of the tea in a few areas. Now similarly I want to do the same, but I want to put foil on top as well. I almost want to create a little sandwich, so we're going to give that a bit of a try. I'm just going to press that down a little bit. I'm going to press this onto the foil as well. Now the next one, I'm going to give this a good dip. There we go. And we're just going to place this down, and then I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt over. So this is what you would do with watercolor to give a little bit of texture as well. So we're going to try that. And then the last one, I'm going to have to do this in 2 parts. So I'm going to dip this first, and then we'll come back for the final bit of this one. So this one just needs to be a plain dipped piece of paper. So I'm going to go and pop these all in the oven, and then when I come back in just a few moments, we'll be able to see how these ones have all turned out. Okay, and we are back. So let's have a little look going through all of these. So this is the creased piece, which I really like. The tea has pulled in certain areas and has created a really nice effect. So something to note about these is that the backside never looks as good. So this would definitely be a case of double dipping. I would do it one way, dip again, do it the other way, let it dry, and then you're going to get that nice even tone over the whole piece. That's if you want a double-sided piece, if you're making a book. If you're making like something to display, not necessary. With this as well, you could iron this to make it nice and flat, get all of those creases that are there out, and then re-crease it or just kind of muss it up so that it looks a little bit more skin-like. So parchment is actually made from skin. It's animal hide. So really good to kind of get that texture in there. The foil, yeah, I mean, it does give a texture. I'm not sure that is the one for me. So I'm going to discard that one. And then, yeah, very similar for the foil on top and bottom. So that one, not for me, unfortunately. That's not going to work. Up here, we have the salt. So if I brush the salt off, yeah, we can see that has really textured. Can you see just how textured that little section there is? So that might be nice in a few little areas. It looks like pitting when, again, you get kind of mold spores growing on paper and parchment. You get this little pitting area, and that's definitely what that looks like. Again, probably a case of a double dip, so you've got it on the back. But yeah, very nice texture, so I like that. And then over here, you might notice these spots. So remember when we dipped the coffee, we got those lines. all I did is I popped this in the oven, I let it dry, I came up, I got a pipette here, or pipette, however you want to say it, and just dripped a couple of spots on here. I did a little bit of drawing on the edge here with a little bit of coffee, and you can see it has made this wonderful damp mark that does actually bleed through. So again, I think this would be double dip for the paper to get the tone that you want, and then this kind of texturing, same with the paint, you would probably do that at the end to get a little bit extra character in there. Right, we have covered quite a lot in terms of how to make a lovely stained piece of paper and the different techniques we can use. I think it's time I went ahead and actually made probably an A5 sheet of aged paper, aged parchment in full, and then take you through the process of how I came to that piece. Okay, so I've taken a little bit of time, and yeah, I think I've come up with something that I like, and I will preface this by saying I've gone hard on the aging of this. I wanted to make this look ancient. This is probably not as hard as I'm going to go when I actually make the paper for the book prop, when we actually come to doing that. But are you ready? We'll have a little countdown. 3, 2, 1. Here we go. This is our aged paper. So there's a few things that I've done to this. First thing I did is I went and deckled the edge first. So I just got a straight edge and I tore the paper, because a lot of these are going to have rough edges. And if you do that after you've stained the paper, it's not going to look right. It's going to look like a fresh rip. And actually, the edges are somewhere where you're going to get smooth edges and smooth tears. So that's why we do that bit first. Then you can see this has been double dipped. It has had some salt in it, so we've got some texture in here. You can see we've got these kind of damp marks as well. I might have added 1 or 2 extra in there than I should have. But even up here, you see this spotting just here. You know, that's such a small detail, but actually it just adds to the age and the texture of the piece. Now, I could go ahead and iron this flat and then use it as a prop. I think this would make a really nice map, or even like a spell scroll where you've got a section missing, maybe an important piece of information for someone on their quest. Would be great for tabletop role players. I mean, this kind of stuff, if you're a DM, you probably know this already, but if you're just getting into being a DM, oh, this kind of stuff is going to really blow your players out of the water when you can produce props like this. They're absolutely gonna flip their lids. So I highly recommend it. And for prop makers as well, you know, books, scrolls, all that kind of stuff. This is all really useful information. So what I have discovered is paint can be a useful tool, not necessarily the best thing to do. Double dipping paper, definitely the way to go. Tea, a strong tea, gives the best color result, and you can really vary the color that you're getting. Coffee is great for adding details, as is salt on wet paper. Drying in the oven, also really good. And then if you're wanting to add extra texture, you can crumple the paper a little bit first, and then you get some of these lines in here as well. Now, talking of paint, as I said, you can go in and add some sections like this where you've got a little bit of extra hue and extra colour. But actually, depending on what type of prop you're making, paint can actually be quite useful. Imagine this is a scroll that has been left in a dank, dark cave for, you know, a couple of 100 years in an old pot. Then actually you might want to paint in some moss or some greenery or some fungus or lichen spreading across some of it as well, so you're getting those greens and greys and some desaturated tones in there. Maybe you've taken this off the body of an ogre, in which case a splash of blue blood, or even a soldier, and then you've got some red blood on there as well. All of these things, this is just the basis of building something that could be really epic and really fun. So I want to do more of this stuff. Obviously we're going to be doing the book in the future, but I think I might do some of those ideas as well. Leave a comment down below. What do you think I should do with this particular piece of paper? And maybe I'll do that and leave it over on my Instagram. And if you've got any ideas for props using aged paper, then leave those down below as well, because I'm going to definitely be doing more prop making and more making in general on here. So I'm always open to your guys' suggestions. But for now, as always, I really hope you've enjoyed today's video, and until next time, goodbye.